Good evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas public talk series and the 30th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture. I'm Evan Franklin, an Associate Professor of Energy and Power Systems here at the University of Tasmania. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you here at the Stanley Burbury Theatre to this evening's vitally important and, I think, highly entertaining lecture. And I wish to extend a special welcome too to everyone joining us online. The Island of Ideas series invites us to explore the big questions shaping our world, together openly and mindful of our distinctive Tasmanian perspectives. Tonight's lecture, Cut Bills, Cut Emissions, Electrify Everything, is exactly that kind of conversation. And right here on this island full of ideas and possibilities, it is the perfect time and the perfect place for just that conversation. Tasmania knows the possibilities and complexities of electrification. In the 1970s and 80s, homes and businesses were built on the promise of abundant low-cost electricity as Tasmania's hydropower network expanded rapidly. It's impossible not to think of this period without recognising the controversy and conflict that occurred, the contest of ideas, if you will, and from that contest, the birth of the political green movement. Growing up in Tasmania, as I did in the 1980s, at least in some households, and I can remind you my last name is Franklin, electrification was something of a dirty word. Fast forward 30 or so years and solar and wind emerged as the likely lowest cost for new build electrical generation anywhere in the world, and we knew we were on the brink of something big. But how would we navigate to a new system based on distributed solar and wind generation, rooftop solar and storage, distributed and engaged customers and flexible loads? And then Saul came along and coined this phrase, which I delight in: electrify everything. At once, the message is both clear and direct. It's practical and it's actionable. And what I love most about it, it's wildly ambitious. And I think wild ambition is what we need at a time like this. But as we gather here in Nipaluna, Hobart, beneath Kunanyi, Mount Wellington, the university recognises that we meet on the unceded lands of the Palawa people, the traditional custodians of Lutruwita, Tasmania. We pay our respects to elders past and present, to those who did not reach elder status, and to all Aboriginal people with us tonight. In reflecting on this place, and as we talk about energy, innovation, and our shared future, we acknowledge the deep continuity of Palawa knowledge and care for country, practices that have sustained the island for tens of thousands of years. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history. This year marks a special milestone, the 30th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture, with the first talk in the late 1980s. This lecture series has brought thought leaders to Tasmania, explored bold ideas, and encouraged public dialogue on the big environmental and societal questions of each era. This lecture honours Dr. Richard Jones, a Tasmanian environmental pioneer. He co-founded the United Tasmania Group, the world's first green political party, and helped establish the Tasmanian Environment Centre, now Sustainable Living Tasmania. Dick Jones combined vision with practical action, laying the foundations for Tasmania's modern environmental movement, a legacy we continue to celebrate through this lecture tonight. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's MC, Andrea Persico. Andrea is the Director and Lead Consultant of AMPT Consulting, specialising in electric vehicle transition and electric vehicle charging projects. With over 20 years of diverse experience in business and project management, Andrea is a skilled communicator and problem solver. She has worked on numerous EV projects, including transitioning fleets to new technology trials. Andrea is also a founding member of Electrify Tasmania and a passionate advocate for climate action and social equity. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Andrea Persico.
Hi. The scales are tipped. Big fossil fuel has big money and oils the political wheels to keep doing what it does. On the other side are scientists, advocates, activists, and community groups who are fueled by idealism, passion, and humanity. Saul Griffith is such. He is a prolific inventor and engineer with an origin story that took him from BHP in Australia to the Silicon Valley by way of Berkeley and a PhD at MIT. Having founded numerous tech companies, Saul has turned his attention to policy work and influencing both governments and communities through his Rewiring America and Rewiring Australia initiatives, Rewiring Aotearoa, and many others as well. And his books, Electrify Everything, The Big Switch, and his latest, Plug In. To both politicians and community, Saul makes the problem and the solution crystal clear. And when he's putting electric motors in vintage Vespers with sidecars, he's making the solution fun as well. Like every movement at the forefront of change, there are victories and losses, and those oiled wheels keep turning. But progress is being made. Rooftop solar accounts for 12.8% of Australian energy production. 90,000 home batteries have been installed since July this year, and Australians are buying electric cars and electric cooktops, and many of these are directly or indirectly because of the advocacy and policy work of this man and the communities that he creates. I'd like to call Saul tireless, but this work is often tiring. He is endlessly passionate, endlessly creative, and endlessly inspiring. Please welcome Dr. Saul Griffith.
So thank you to everyone for saying so many nice things. I'll buy the drinks tonight. And thanks for hosting me here at University of Tasmania. I'm Saul Griffith. These are the 4 books I've written on electrification. I'm not sure I can write another book on electrification. The first book I wrote was Electrify. It took me about 10 years. I started writing it in 2008, weirdly enough, and didn't really finish until 2020. It changed a huge amount and really got written all in a fever during the presidential campaign in the US in 2019, 2020. And it was very much focused on what would climate policy look like that gives us the climate outcome we want. You know, something like 1.5 degrees was the goal. And it was very wonky. It had lots and lots and lots and lots of graphs. I learned something important about modern book writing is that 55% of people listen to your book. They don't read it. And I remember talking to somebody about this book. I was so proud of it. And he said, you know, your graphs don't sound good on audio. So I've since sort of learned to change my writing style. So I have described Electrify as a love letter to whoever the incoming president in the US was going to be, Joe Biden. It had some influence in the writing of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the big climate bill that passed under Joe Biden, which unfortunately is being torn apart by the Trump administration. You know, a couple of years ago, the people who really thought about energy policy and climate policy in the US, we were all celebrating the victory that was the largest climate bill in human history. It wasn't enough to hit a 1.5 and maybe not even a 2-degree target, but it was a big step in the right direction. And the tragedy we have now is the backsliding of the US, pulling out of Paris, obviously, but probably 2/3 of the earmarked money from the Inflation Reduction Act has been cancelled by the Trump administration. So that's a bit of a problem. I then wrote The Big Switch, which was sort of for Australian thought leaders. I've since learned that despite everyone saying there's a thought leader, it's not really a thing. You have to have thought followers in order to be a thought leader. I haven't met a lot of thought followers. So anyway, Big Switch was a good book. Quarterly essay was then about electrification for communities. So what is the economic consequences of meeting our climate goals? What are communities' role in it? And that there's some of that material I'll actually talk about tonight. I think it's important. And then most recently, my publisher asked me, can I write Electrify for the average Australian punter? So this is meant to be household level description of how to electrify your own life and what the consequences of that are. And so as this is a book tour, I'm going to mostly talk about plug-in, and a lot of the graphs I'm going to show tonight come out of that book. I apologize in advance if they don't sound good on audio, but at least you have me for live audio for these graphs today. We'll talk about the consequences of this electrification. We can touch on geopolitics, the different consequences of what you can do in your own life, what we need governments to do, and what the outlook might be like. So this is the one slide that I'm going to test you all on at the end of my talk this evening. I understand everyone at the University of Tasmania is a very quick study. This is all of the energy. This was actually the chart that I developed with colleagues funded by the US Department of Energy to try and understand in as great a detail as possible all of the energy flow through the US economy. So this is called a Sankey diagram. You start on the left. On the far left there, it's oil or petroleum, nuclear power inputs, natural gas, coal, solar, wind, and then it goes through all of what they call the sectors of the economy. The industrial sector, you've heard all of these terms. Australia uses the same sectorial breakdown. Industrial sector, the transportation sector, the residential sector, the commercial sector, and the government sector. So they're all the colors. And it's, I spent a year compiling the data for this, and it means I know absurd things about energy flow. So 0.6% of US energy flow is driving to school to kids on school buses. Nearly 1% is using natural gas to pump the rest of the natural gas through 1.2 million miles of pipeline. It's 3.5% of US energy flow is using oil to fractionate oil into what we call petrol and diesel, what Americans call gasoline. And so, there's a lot of knowledge in here. The reason I built this graph was to say, well, how do we, and you can debate this, but my thought was humans aren't showing a lot of capacity at changing their behavior. So how do you do everything on this graph in a way that can be zero emission? So this is the original thought idea behind Electrify Everything. And it turns out you can't make enough biofuels to do all of these things. You'd have to basically harvest every single plant on the planet every year if every human was trying to live this life. So that's not going to work. Nuclear can work. It's electrification by definition. You can't sequester all the carbon from these things. So the only real way to live the lifestyles, so you see squiggly lines here, I see the suburbs. This is the manifestation of how you live represented as energy flow. And the only way to continue to live in societies like the ones we have is to basically electrify every single one of those streams, figure out how to electrify those things, electrify the motorbikes, electrify the lawnmowers, electrify the cars, electrify the cooking, electrify the water heating. So this was the Electrify Everything slide. Hypothetical of the book Electrify, it's, writing in 2019, it was like, if we get rooftop solar to less than $1 a watt, if we get batteries under about $500 a kilowatt hour, which we can predict is going to happen because the prices are dropping, then all of this should mean that every economy runs cheaper. It was the hypothetical. In some respects, plug in the latest book is the victory lap. Turns out Australians got rooftop solar to about 65 US cents a watt installed on roof. And the batteries are now, I'm buying batteries from Asia at about $150 a kilowatt hour. So these things are now true. And because that is true, the economic story of electrification is good. So here's the one graph that I used in the book to try and describe everything there is to know about energy in one graph. So the last one was the 5-year-old version of everything to know about energy in one graph. This is the new one. So you'll see here different ways of doing the things we do. So there's electricity, there's driving, there's heating with solar, there's industrial. And this tries to convert all of the things that we do day to day into a price per kilowatt hour. So you can see we can buy electricity from the grid, that first thing, 25 to 50 cents per kilowatt hour. Rooftop solar, this is Australia's miracle contribution, is somewhere between 4 and 7 cents per kilowatt hour after financing. So it's super cheap electricity. Driving, the black things are fossil fuel activities. So you'll see a petrol car at the top of driving. Petrol at $2 a litre in Australia is the equivalent of paying about $1 a kilowatt hour. So this is why if you drive an electric car, it's way cheaper to use. It's way cheaper than driving a petrol car because the energy you're putting in it is so much cheaper. You can see there's a price of the fast electric chargers, you know, the 80 cent per kilowatt hour ones on the highway. They're about 50 cents or 50, 80 cents a kilowatt hour. There's the electricity from the grid and there's electricity from solar. And you can see that they all beat the cost of driving. You can see for heating, gas is the first one. It's about somewhere between 15 and 25 cents per kilowatt hour equivalent to buy natural gas. That is in fact cheaper in most places in Australia than electricity doing resistance heating. However, the modern heat pump, which is the miracle, is the next little dot along. And a heat pump has this sort of miraculous property that where it's 300% efficient. Then 1 unit of energy makes 3 units of heat. So if you use a heat pump, you actually can beat gas heating. And that applies for water heating, that applies for other heating, and it's a slam dunk. And then if you can heat with solar electricity, then you're totally golden. In Australia, it's lower. So this sort of is what I think about energy price arbitrage. The unfortunate and hard thing that's still hard is the thing way over on the far right. So I'm going to leave that to the very last slide tonight. We're going to punt the hardest thing until last. But you can see industrial coal is only a couple of cents a kilowatt hour. Industrial natural gas is maybe 3 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on where you are. And so this is why electrifying and decarbonizing steel, cement, heavy industry is difficult, because they pay the wholesale price for fossil fuels. So when you're buying petrol, you're paying a retail price. When you're buying natural gas in your house, it's a retail price. That's why this distributed energy revolution is winning, because you're up against retail. It's why it's hard at industry. All right, so I'm going to say kilowatt hour a lot, and I'm going to say watts a lot. So this is just the super breakdown. This was actually there was something called the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1930s America, where they were trying to, under Roosevelt, to electrify rural America because it was going to save cost. And they had these wonderful pictures of how much sewing you could do with a kilowatt hour and how much of all the things. So I've tried to reproduce those. 1 kilowatt hour of electricity gets you 5 to 8 kilometers of driving. It's about 1 full day of your own labor is 1 kilowatt hour. It's about 60 to 100 hours of LED lighting. You can cook 1 meal, like a pasta meal. It's about 1 kilowatt hour for a family, 1 load of dishes, 10 liters of water. So that's a lot of tea. And it's half a day of production of one of those panels that you see on people's roofs now. And you can see the other things. And then so that's energy. The other units we talk about are watts. This is units of power. So this is constant energy use. 200 kilowatts is about the amount of power of a modern fast electric car. In the old units, that's about 250 horsepower. 100 watts is if you are working pretty hard all day. That's what 1 human laborer can do. 10 watts is the power for an LED. 100 gigawatts, which is 100 billion watts. That's how much power it takes to run the entire Australian economy. 1,000 watts or a kilowatt is a toaster. One of the big wind turbines. Well, this is not so big anymore. 5 years ago, 5 megawatts was a big wind turbine, 5 million watts. That would run about 5,000 households. The new wind turbines are going towards 15 megawatts. Your fridge uses 100 watts, an electric bike is 250, and the output of that 1 solar panel is about 400 watts. So it's just to give you some cartoons for reference. All right, this is going to be the depressing part of the talk. I noticed that some people brought children. This is the bit where you cover their ears. All right, this is the reality check, however. So this chart talks about what we have to do if we want 1.5 or 2 degrees versus current policies versus no climate policies at all. This graph was drawn basically when the whole world was still subscribed to Paris, and just before we had done the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, where we were headed for a 3.2 degree world if all the countries did what they said they were going to do. The IRA from America probably brought that down to about 2.5 degrees. So where those pledges and targets line is. So all of that is still insufficient for the 1.5, 2 degree world we wanted. Now that Donald Trump blew up the UN a couple of weeks ago in New York, unsubscribed from Paris, is giving permission to Russia and Saudi Arabia to double down. We look like we're moving actually more towards the pink and above the orange. So we're back we look like we're heading towards a 3+ degree world. But what I want to really talk about here is even that's optimistic, because starting in the 2000s, there was an idea that we were going to be able to use negative emissions, and the United Nations allowed every country to model more and more negative emissions into our climate models. And in fact, this was run in about 2019. They run thousands of models. So you can see some faint lines in that chart there. Every single one of those faint lines is one of what they call a computer model run to see what climate we're going to get, what climate outcome under the different illustrative pathways. The different illustrative pathways meant if we're really ambitious, if we're middling ambitious, etc. But you can see all of these, the great majority go below zero. So that means that after the middle of the century, they are negative emission pathways. And the units on this graph are billions of tons of CO2. So for perspective, today we burn 10 billion tons of fossil fuels a year, which creates about 40 billion tons a year of CO2. But all of these models suggest that after mid-century, we're going to bury 10 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide back into the earth. And every country subscribed to this because it was possible to pretend to the people back home that we're meeting our climate targets, but they were doing it with negative emissions. And just to visualize it, all of the world's fossil fuel industries today pull 10 billion tons out. So to bury 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year, you need all of the infrastructure that we currently move to move fossil fuels to be burying stuff. This is widely considered not physically possible. In fact, I think page 4,976 of the UN IR5 report, there's a little footnote that strikes me as important. Scientists do not necessarily believe that this is a realizable amount of negative emissions. So here's a bit of a reality check. So existing policies is that black line, post-US IRA policies is that dotted black line. The blue line is to hit 1.75 degrees of warming with unrealistic but assumed carbon dioxide removal. So they're talking about if we have all of that unrealistic CO2 removal from the UN models. The yellow line is the realistic line where most people think maybe we can do 1 billion of those 10 billion a year using trees and seaweed. And so that's the yellow line. And what that really means is how fast you have to decarbonize is that yellow line. Look how much steeper that is than the blue line or what we're doing. And here you can see it again. So the black is all the coal you get to burn, or all the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas you get to burn, because we're going to do all of these green and yellow negative emissions in the future. LULUCF, that means the land use and the land clearing and the seaweed and the tree solutions. You can see that's only a tiny bit. The yellow is all the engineered. So we're literally betting humanity's future on engineered carbon sequestration. But like I say, it's unrealistic to imagine we're going to build an industry as big as the 3 biggest industries in the world to bury a product that has negative value, meaning it costs you to do it. On the right is the scenario with no with no carbon removal. You can do a fancy thing. This is the total amount of fossil fuels you're allowed to burn under that first scenario and under the second scenario. And then I do a little mathy trick here, and you subtract the difference between those two. And the reason everyone went in on all of these carbon credits is pretty obvious when you look at this. So it implies the amount of carbon that gets burnt with carbon dioxide removal versus without. It's worth $37 trillion at wholesale value and $300 trillion at retail value to pretend that we're going to do this carbon sequestration. So this was the money behind the lobbying that made us unrealistic about our about negative emissions. which I believe Tasmania has signed up to as a theory of change as well, unfortunately. And I just want to go back just for a little bit of a sanity check. Remember, this is a 1.75 degree world. And you can see that yellow line. They assumed that we were going to start in 2020 going pretty much straight down by half, 75% emission reductions by 2030. What we've done is actually gone upwards. It's now 2025. So this is even harder now. And so realistically, even if the world tries as hard as it can, the best we can do now is probably 2 degrees of warming. 1.5 is really off the table. I believe we should try and hit that 2 degree target desperately. And then this talk is really about how do we do that and how do we do that positively. So electrifying everything. I got you all super depressed because now you realize just how hard it is. Sorry about that. But I do think it's worth staring it in the face because it should hopefully motivate us on what we have to do and what speed we have to do it. So this is the good news story about electrifying everything. This is a story about my friend Fred, real character. I interviewed 2 people in the book who are maybe even nerdier about electrification than me, and they've done the whole electrification thing for their house and their households. And just firstly, to state the importance, if I go back to that original slide of all of the energy use in the US, 42% of the emissions of that big chart are decisions you make at the kitchen table. So households globally, and it turns out that this is true average globally, we make decisions on how we drive, how we cook, how we heat that are about 42% of emissions. So it is significant for us to understand those are the decisions we have agency over, and those are the decisions that's our piece of the pie. It's not to absolve government and industry. They're the other emissions that they also need to do work. But it's to say that households are important. Before I introduce Fred, I was another character in the book plug-in, a guy called Chris Kerr. I interviewed him. He started electrifying his home in 2019. He's got an engineering mindset by his own admission. His holiday to Bali was cancelled because of COVID. He used the money that he saved because he's got a family of 4 kids, he and his partner. They used all of the airfares to buy a 16 kilowatt solar system because they were stuck at home. He got a $1,500 electricity bill 1 month, and he's like, that's too much. I'm sick of this. I'm going to solve it forever. Bought the biggest solar thing he could. Total dad math, by the way. I would do the same. I don't like this bill. Buy the biggest solar system. And then he realized he had way more electricity than he needed. So he started electrifying everything in the house. So he was in it for the return on investment. He over-optimized the water heating, shall we say. Somebody in the house had a cold shower. He realized that there were other constituencies, not necessarily in it for the return on investment. We might recall that the return on comfort, the return on health in the household. And because he's got 4 modern Australian children, they were in it for the return on the environment. And I really like this as a framing. Because really the book, and I'm about to tell you this story in more detail, is it doesn't matter now whether you come at this for the return on the investment, the return on comfort, the return on health, the return on climate. For many, many parts of the world, and Australia is one of the first to really get there in a convincing way, these things are no longer in conflict. So we can do these things. So this is my friend Fred. He lives in Sydney. He's got a 5-person household, 3 daughters, swimming pool, 15 kilowatts of solar, 22 kilowatts of hours of batteries, 2 electric cars. He also, you might tell, is a bit of an engineer. He made these graphs for me. You'll see a mess of tiny little dots up there. This is 3 years of the solar energy production on his house. So there's 2022, 2023, 2024. They're the different dots. And you can see some days there isn't a lot. They're the windy, cold, dark days. And then there's a lot of days when they are. You can see his average daily production from his solar is the dotted line. Below that, the average daily use. And you can see nearly all year and every month of the year, he can pretty much make all of the electricity he uses for his completely all electric household. You can see his consumption varies hugely between 20 and 80 kilowatt hours per day. And on the bottom, the last graph, you can see if it's a circle, that's a day when he gave the electricity grid net positive electricity. And the stars are days where he had to import a little bit. You can kind of guess in the summer, he's exporting a ton. In winter, some days he doesn't need any, but a lot of days in winter, he needs to import a little bit. His household makes 141% of the electricity that the household needs for all of their activities in the course of a year. And so it's a pretty extraordinary story. He monitors absolutely everything. So the top one there is the savings in dollars per month. In the middle chart is savings per dollars per month. And the top, it's the gray bar is his solar generation. The bars next to it are the house, the vehicles, and the swimming pool. You can see nearly every month of the year, he's positive. The coldest months, he's using a bit more energy than he's making. You can see how much money he saves every month. He's saving $800, $900 every month. You can see the emissions that he's avoiding every month. And he breaks those down in the emissions that he's avoiding from generating his own power, the electricity self-power, the emissions he's saving other people by selling them his rooftop solar, and the emissions he's saving from avoiding gas. It's pretty extraordinary. Here's his 2 electric cars. This is their battery throughout the year. And it's all of the data. And he can tell you nearly all the year he's charging most of his cars from rooftop solar. He's saving about $8,000 a year. And he's making an extra $1,000 a year selling his excess battery and solar through his battery back to the grid during the peak. And you can tell he's a little obsessive, and he went back to university and is writing a master's thesis on this stuff. But this could be true for a huge swath of Australia. Probably 60 or 70% of Australian homes have big enough rooftop and live in sunny enough places to live some version of this. And that's why when I was asked to write this book, we looked at all of the data, and the average Australian household, if they followed the advice, electrify everything, would save about $4,500 or $5,000 a year. That's called microeconomics, the economics of the house. The macroeconomics are just as good. If Australians all electrified everything in their life, not tomorrow, but as they fail. So, 5 years from now, your water heater might fail. If you get an electric one, then 8 years from now, your petrol car might fail. Get an electric car in 8 years' time. It would take us about 20 years to get the whole country to zero that way, because it takes about 20 years for all the machines to turn over. We would save $1 trillion during that period as a nation, which is a pretty good news story. So the book is far less technical than all those graphs imply. What I really wanted to do is just say, get freaked out about climate change. That's why I gave you the depressing piece of the talk. And then I want you to be anxious and stressed and angry. And I want you to hurry up and make 5 good decisions over the next 20 years. And this is to say, I think it's bad if we get Australians or anyone in the world going to a place of guilt. Oh, I can't afford to do this yet today. There's this reason or this reason. I think guilt is a bad thing. So the 5 big decisions, I want people to understand it's urgent, but I want them to understand we have time to do it over the next 20 years. Make a plan now to make those 5 big decisions. What are the 5 big decisions? They're these things. It's how you heat your water. That's my cartoon of a heat pump water heater. How you heat your home. That's a reverse cycle air conditioning system, also known as a heat pump that can heat your home. Electrify your cooking, electrify your car. And then the 5th decision is where you get your electricity from, which needs to be renewable or clean. And so you have the options in Australia of putting your own solar on the roof and your own batteries, or of purchasing green electricity from the grid. If we all make those 5 decisions well, like I said, over the next 20 years, we can hit our climate targets pretty easily and save money, which is a good news story. The even better news story, if you look globally, so America is backsliding on climate, but Electrify basically said, America, can you please be like America was under Roosevelt for World War II? When America decided to enter World War II, they realized they needed airplanes, they needed ships, they needed guns, they needed tanks. And they were called the critical war materials. And America had a few hundred airplanes in 1939, and they were making 50,000 a month by 1943. And that's how they won the war. The argument of Electrify was to hit our climate targets. America, instead of bullets, it's batteries. instead of tanks, it's electric cars. Instead of airplanes, it's wind turbines. And if America got into that level of effort, then we could hit our climate targets. Tragedy is America does not look to be doing that. The good news, however, is China has done it in a way that nobody expected, at a scale that nobody expected. So if you literally just took the advancing rates of production of China on all the critical components, the battery, the solar, the EVs, the heat pumps, the whole world could be decarbonized by about 2038 or 2040. So that is, put the politics of both China and America aside, because I'm not sure that either of them are perfect examples of good politics at the moment. But it is to say the world has the industrial capacity to hit that 2-degree target now. And we thought America was going to build a lot of it, but China did. Australia has a huge role in that. We sell 55% of the world's lithium. So a huge amount of our metals and our mineral ores go into making these things and these solutions. And it is possible to believe we're on target to hit the goal. So this is back to the book. This is the mythical Australian house on the left. The average Australian house is 2.7 people. It really sucks to be the 0.7. It's 1.8 cars. It's not so tragic to be the 0.8 car, but that's what we are. And this is the average Australian household uses 120 kilowatt hours per day of all types of energy. Only about 10% is electricity. A ton of it is gas or LPG. The biggest thing that we use in our daily lives is our petrol or diesel. It's about 60%. And the little bit at the top is the waste of generating electricity. So when you burn coal, only about a quarter of the energy in the coal becomes electricity. When you burn gas, only about a third. So there's quite a lot of waste for the electricity in Australia that's made with fossil fuels. By use, you can see it on the right, and it's those 5 decisions: what you drive, how you heat your home, how you heat your hot water, how you cook, and where you get your electricity from. And the average Australian house, I expressed it in the book, I think, in a way that's interesting. We all know it's bad to have multiple subscriptions to different movie services. Every household has 3 subscriptions to energy. You have your electricity subscription, you have your gas subscription. You may not think about it that way, but you spend on average in Australia $100 a week on your petrol subscription, right? But you've become socialized. That's what you do. You swipe the magic card, you insert the magic nozzle, and you drive it away for $100 every week. So I think the interesting, I use that subscription model, hopefully, because it encourages you, oh, gee, one subscription, would be good. Which one subscription can do everything? And it turns out that that's electricity. This is a graph of the extraordinary efficiency of electrification. So we talked about it before. 121 kilowatt hours a day is the average Australian household. If you electrify everything, the same household, same drafty Australian house with giant gaps under the doors, same oversized cars, just the efficiency of electrification alone means that house running off renewables would only need about 32-ish kilowatt hours per day to operate. That broadly expressed upon the economy. So if you could run the whole US economy from that first slide on about 45% of the energy of the fossil fuel America if it was all electric. Again, this is the substitution model for solving climate change. It means you can all have your same Ford Ranger, just has to be electric. We could do even better if we rode more bicycles and had more trains. As I flew to Melbourne from Sydney this week, I was lamenting, why haven't we built an ultra-fast electric train yet? So we could do better, but even in the case where we're just electrifying what we have, it's a good idea. It saves a huge amount of energy and it's very efficient. The 3 subscriptions on average for Australian household, that's middle graph, $8,000 a year. If you went to all electric, buying electricity from the grid, it's about $4,200 a year. And if you can do half of your electricity with solar, or more, it's about $1,600 a year. So this is the promise of electrification. And then the emissions is the last slide. If you're doing the emissions off the grid, it's actually better in Tasmania because you guys have so much hydro, but in New South Wales, where we still have brown coal, that's your emissions. You know, you halve your emissions going all electric if you're using the grid, and you can go to zero either because you do rooftop solar now, like my friend Fred, or in the future when we've built out enough renewables that the whole grid is electric. All right, so these are the energy bills, like I said, but as we know, we have to buy the thing. So you have to buy the more expensive car to be running an electric car. You have to buy a slightly more expensive water heater to have the heat pump water heater. So the bills are good and you save a lot of money, but let's look at the total costs, which is a project of making electrification cheap. So electrify everything is message one. Then you have to make electrification cheap. This is the household that runs the gas appliances and the petrol vehicles. The upfront cost, that means the cost of the hardware is cheaper. That's a recognition that even though the EVs have got a lot cheaper, they're still a bit more expensive. You're paying interest on top of that. Surprising amount of your energy bill is the interest to buy the kit. However, even today, even though it's more expensive to buy the pieces, it is cheaper to run the all-electric household, and the best of all is you're running it on solar and batteries. This slide I'm going to use as a slide to talk about equity in our energy transition, fairness. The book tour has been called the Faster and Fairer Tour. We need to go faster for the reasons I talked about at the beginning. We need it to be fairer. So who would benefit? The wealthiest 5% of Australian homes can probably pay cash to buy the things at the bottom here, the upfront costs, and they don't even notice it. In fact, the wealthiest 5 or 10% of households in Australia probably spend more on alcohol than they do on energy. Uncomfortable laughter. Everyone's like, oh, is that me? Probably is. Statistically is. The next 20% of Australian households probably can afford to do that. It's implied by this graph. You're paying interest on these things. You're financing the car. When you refinance the mortgage, you take out enough money to electrify the kitchen and the water heater. That probably works for another 20% of Australian households. The 20% of households at the very bottom of the Australian socioeconomic stack, they don't have the cash. They're probably living in public housing. We just have to be honest with ourselves. The statement I like to say is you can't half solve climate change. If the richest 50% solve it, it's still not solved. So we're going to have to just look at and address the harder problems. So the 20% of the bottom are very hard, but there are social housing pathways. The 60% in the middle is the hard version. So this implies you can get finance, but there's a huge swath of Australian households in the middle that don't have access to finance. They might be older households that, they don't really, financing for 20 years doesn't make sense because they may not see 20 years into the future. And then there's all the households in Australia that have a low credit score. I think this is why we need big, ambitious policy. I often talk about all of these decisions as Australia's new energy infrastructure. So Andrew actually said in the introduction, about 13% of Australian electricity now comes from our rooftops. We are a significant provider of the energy infrastructure of our country now. When all 20 million Australian households have an electric vehicle, those electric vehicles will be a larger battery by about 6 or 10 times than all of our pumped hydro and the new Snowy project. So we are now literally making investments in infrastructure. Why am I trying to make that analogy? The Australian government forever has been in the business of providing low interest loans to large companies to build infrastructure and all sorts of concessions to build critical infrastructure. So I'm trying to justify that the Australian government microeconomically to help the household save money in a cost of living case, macroeconomically to help the nation become more economically productive and save $1 trillion, and then for interests of a more robust Australian energy infrastructure. I believe the Australian government needs to come in and help figure out how to finance the big 60% of households in the middle on how we on how we do this project quickly and fairly. Otherwise, we're just never going to get there in time. If we wait for every house to do it secondhand or to pass through some house speculators project, it's going to take too long. But the numbers support doing it. This is one of my favorite slides I've ever made. This is the extraordinary statement that electrification is anti-inflationary, which I can now convince a lot of modern economists to believe. So the black line is the total cost of energy, petrol, gas, and electricity for running Australian household. It sort of wiggles about, but is roughly going up at that gray line, which is the rate of inflation. You can see dips like COVID, boosts like Ukraine when the gas price goes up. The fascinating thing about when you electrify your whole house and when you're financing it is that you turn all of the volatility of those future energy bills into a constant monthly interest payment. And so your cost of energy is really built in. This would be in the household that's running, like Fred's running nearly entirely off its own solar. It would go up a little if you were also buying some from the grid. But the point here is like we now have this extraordinary economic tool called electrification to help lower cost of living and to lower inflation. So I think that's pretty fascinating. These slides I just threw in because a lot of the conceit of tonight's talk is that you are all homo economicus, meaning you are humans who make rational economic decisions. This is to say we absolutely don't. Here, this is probably the better way of saying it. This is from the Royal Automobile Club of Queensland. They look at the total cost of ownership for different types of cars, different categories. And you can see, you know, a light passenger. So this is a tiny little Honda Civic or something, about $1,000 a month. A big all-terrain vehicle. So this is a Land Cruiser, well over $2,000 a month. And the electric car they have over here on the right. This is to say that we make romantic decisions about cars and it has big economic consequences. So maybe, you know, we aren't as homo economicus as you think. And I think the electric vehicle one says this the best. You know, people recognize, for those who follow the electric vehicle market, the cheapest electric cars are the ones right over there on the right, the MG4 and the BYD Dolphin. They're the little tiny electric ones. If you're in those, you're saving money compared to petrol. But if you've decided you want the really fancy 9-seat LDV or the big, or the, you know, a Tesla Y, you can actually ruin all of the savings I've just made available to you by vainly choosing a car. Which is just a concession to maybe we aren't all perfectly economically rational agents, which is a shame because, you know, we might need to be to solve climate change. So we've talked about making electrification cheap. A big part of that is about making the finance available. One way to think about this energy transition we're going through is it's a shift from fuels to finance. What do I mean by that? Today, you buy a cheap subscription and a cheap machine, and then you pay an expensive prescription for the fuels to feed it every month. We're going into a world where you buy a slightly more expensive machine and you feed it much, much cheaper fuels month to month. And so how do we solve that more expensive problem up front? That's a finance problem. So we got to make electrification cheap, including financing. We also have to make electricity cheap. This has been the problem in America. There's a lot of reasons behind it in America. We did a good job in the policy world there of they had a whole bunch of clever subsidies and things built into the Inflation Reduction Act that were going to make electrification cheap, like buying the kit. But the price of electricity has been going up and up and up. In fact, someone showed me a chart yesterday that graphs the price of electricity in the US since OpenAI, the AI company, started. And just in the last 18 months, it's gone up the price of electricity has gone up 28%. So just at the moment, we need everyone to be like, yay, electrification, we're going to save the planet, it's going to be great. We made electricity really expensive, which is, I think, part of the cultural backlash against these things in the US. Fortunately, one of the biggest problems in the US is their rooftop solar is 7 to 9 times more expensive than ours. So they have some of those wins to gain. That might help them a little bit. But I still think it's worth contemplating if we want to succeed at this project, not everyone's going to do it for the return on comfort or the return on environment. We should still be interested in the game of making electricity cheap. So this is a pretty remarkable graph. This is the price of electricity in Australia from 1956 until recently. And you can see we were doing a great job through the 50s, 60s, 70s, even through the 80s at making electricity cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as we made the coal plants and the gas plants more efficient. And we made the electricity system more efficient, connected it better. And then we had this, everything's gone wrong. Then we had this crazy idea in the 1990s to start privatizing the grid. And then we decided that not only should we privatize it, which is pretty neoliberal, let's be even more neoliberal and introduce competition measures. And it's at that moment that we created the National Electricity Market in 1996. We used to have vertical utilities, meaning the same energy company would make the electricity, transmit it, distribute it, and sell it to you. That's still true here in Tasmania. It's not true. It's a little bit true in Tasmania. It's definitely not true in the rest of the country. Anyway, all of that neoliberalism did what to the price of electricity? So look at it going up from 1996. That's a problem. It may or may not have been a good idea at the time. Maybe it was an experiment worth running. It hasn't worked out. And what I believe we need to do now is very seriously look at the structure of the Australian electricity market. I'm sorry if you came here to talk about climate change. It's a bummer to me that I want you to be worried about climate change and then I want you to get really excited about electricity market reform. Raise your hand if you like electricity market reform. It's not bad. Nearly had quorum there. All right, here's a nerdy electricity market graph. So this is all of the pieces of Australian electricity. Again, this is the mythical average Australia. You're Tasmanians, you're absolutely special. You have a huge amount of cheap hydro. So your picture would look a little bit different. Not that much though. Generation is about 13 cents a kilowatt hour. That's the thing that you do cheaper here because you build a bunch of cheap hydro in the 80s. Transmission is about 3 cents. Distribution, so the local poles and wires are the largest proportion of your electricity bill. And in Tasmania, that's an even larger portion because your generation is cheaper on average. Metering costs you a little bit. That could go down if we make it digital. Then there's the retailing, which is about 8 cents. So it's about 40 cents a kilowatt hour on average in Australia, and about 40% is the distribution cost. And then rooftop solar up there is 5 cents. I just put that there to say that's a good idea. Diesel generator there at the bottom is 60 cents a kilowatt hour. That's just to say that's a bad idea. Except in emergency, maybe, with biodiesel. Anyway, the reason to highlight this is, one of the reasons is the distribution grids are only utilized about 25 to 40% in Australia. So we design them for the worst case scenario. That is, in the middle of winter, everyone turns their heating on at the same time and the kettle. It has to have enough capacity to survive that moment. Or in Northern Australia, everyone turns their air conditioner on at 7 p.m. on a hot summer's day, cracks open a beer, leaves the freezer open, and that's the worst case scenario you have to design for in Queensland. Because the grid is designed for that, the rest of the year it's only using about 25% of the wires. So the thing we now can do is put some batteries on this distribution grid, including the ones on the household. We know that we have to, if you remember the slides about energy use, today an Australian household uses 14 kilowatt hours. In the future, it's going to use 30. So we need 2.5 times as much electricity because we're going to electrify your cars and your things. The good news is we're going to be able to fit all of that pretty much over the same wires with just the addition of some batteries. And if you double or triple the amount of electricity on the same wires, you're going to make that distribution, if we're smart about it, we can make the cost of that distribution go down. And that will help not just the people who have rooftop solar, but the people who don't have access to rooftop solar and the renters, because we can, if we get this project right, we can lower the cost of electricity for everyone there. We can also continue to lower the cost of solar and wind. and that'll make the cost of generation go down. That's the source of the quote, wind and solar is now cheaper than coal and gas. That is true at that generation piece. So we should be able to drive that down as well. My guess is we should be able to make electricity about 25% cheaper. The other thing that will go down a little bit, supply charges. So you pay a fixed supply charge up the top. So the average Australian pays 8 cents a kilowatt hour for the privilege of being connected. But if you double or triple the amount of electricity you're using pro rata, that'll go down as well. And then if you maximize the amount of rooftop solar you have on the far right, that's going to be great. You can now say a pretty simple thing about the Australian electricity system. If we want the cheapest possible electricity system for Australia, we maximize the rooftop solar on the right. We then maximize the solar that we have in our community. Think about putting solar on the church, on the school, on the Bunnings, on the Woolies, over car parks. Then use Tasmanian hydro and South Australian wind and Queensland solar, connect them all together. And that's how we can build the cheapest possible energy system for Australia. However, we're not guaranteed to get it. This is the grid as we designed it in the 20th century. The big generating things out here on the left, we're just going to send electricity one way, that big blue sine wave, through the transmission, through the distribution system, into the households, into the appliances, and all the electricity would flow one way and you would just have to buy electricity from the grid. But we now know it's going to look more like this, right? So this is Frank's house over on the far right. It's generating solar, putting somebody in the battery, it's powering its own house, and then there's that battery. It's sending electricity back, and then all of the houses on the block are sending electricity back, and some of that electricity is going back to industry or back into transportation or other places. If you sell your electricity company your excess solar today, we pretend that the electrons go all the way back to head office. So if I'm an AGL user and I live in Wollongong, so I pretend when I sell them my electricity for 2 cents a kilowatt hour, that my electrons go all the way to Melbourne, and then they send them all the way back to my neighbor, and my neighbor pays 38 cents for the same electrons. It is illegal in Australia to put an extension cord over the fence to your neighbor. I mean, you laugh, but you shouldn't. You should be enraged. We are protecting the system for the existing incumbent players. And so you have to transact through the network, and we're making that really complicated. But if we're really sensible, because Australian rooftops can provide all the electricity we need for the great majority of our housing and domestic uses, we would enable me to sell my electricity to my neighbor, and I'm totally willing to pay the poles and wires people a couple of cents to get it from my house to their house. That would increase the utilization of the grid, which will also lower the cost of electricity. This is to say, we're protecting the monopolies, and we have the technology to build a democratic energy system where we all help each other lower our energy bills, but we're still preventing the market for designing for that outcome, which is a bit of a shame. So that's just to make you angry that that's something we have to fight for. Oh yes, now here we go. This is the last slide. You're all going to breathe out. Whew, thank God, no more charts. Sorry about the charts. So, story so far, climate change is terrible. Good news, you only have to make 5 good decisions in 20 years. Better news, it's going to lower your cost of energy. Even better news, the majority of respiratory illness worldwide is caused by burning fossil fuels. In fact, burning natural gas in your house kills your pets because all the NOxes and SOxes go down to ground level. I learned from a study we did in the US that people care more about their deaths of their cat than they do about their kids. I want to buy billboards and I want to put natural gas kills kittens. If anyone wants to sponsor that campaign, let me know at the end of the talk. So anyway, we know what to do to solve climate change. It's going to save us money. It's going to save your cats. It's also going to save your children and your children's future. And if we fight for a fair redesign of our electricity market that compensates Australians for the work they are doing building Australian energy infrastructure, we're going to lower the price of electricity for everyone. All of that is great news. And then you say, well, what about industry? What about the other half of the emissions globally? What's going to happen with those? And so this is the really hard thing about this chart is those two things on the far right is that industrial coal and industrial gas is really, really, really cheap. But to tease, in 2020, these things were known as the hard to decarbonize sectors. Has everyone heard that term? Long distance aviation, long distance shipping, steel, cement, hard to decarbonize. The good news is now in 2025, in large thanks to the science funding that America used to do, because they've just cancelled half of it, we should worry that America has just cancelled the funding that has made all of the future come true forever. There are now technologies where we're going to make iron with electricity and no fossil fuels that use less energy, just the same story that it was for electrification of everything else. There's now iron making processes and cement making processes that are all electric. It's called electrochemistry. And they use about 2/3 of the energy of fossil fuels to make the same ton of steel. And you could now start to squint at the South Australian electricity market where the price of electricity is negative for about 6 hours a day because they have so much renewables. You can probably get 3, 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour electricity there happening. If you put those into these new electric industrial processes, then we now also have a pathway to make iron and cement and the things we need cheaper than they are today, 100% renewable, zero emissions. This is to end on the note that macroeconomically for a lot of countries in the world, we should just be going full throttle at electrification and solving climate change because it's in our economic interest. And especially for Australia, because we're going to be making green iron and green cement for the world. It's a great outlook for us. There's no reason not to go faster. And that's just to leave you with the thought that now the problem really is politics and we're going to have to fight to get the future we want. So thank you.
Thank you for your very thought-provoking presentation, Saul. Put up your hand if you are, if you do have questions. We have a couple of roving mics, and as we get to those questions, I'll, actually, maybe if you want to just grab that one right there.
Thank you. It was a great speech. I'm very interested in the position that the Australian government has to acquire assets in the interests of Australia. Could they perhaps acquire Adani?
I mean, I think we owned Adani beforehand. This is going to sound a bit odd. There's a guy called William Wilberforce. Anyone know who William Wilberforce was? So William Wilberforce, America got rid of England got rid of slavery about 100 years before America did, because this guy, William Wilberforce, thought it was immoral. And so he lobbied for about 20 years to stop slavery in England. And eventually they created this huge pile of money through the Bank of England to buy out the slaves. And they bought the freedom of all the slaves. And it was only literally 150 years later that the last of the interest payments for that borrowed money to free the slaves was paid off. And I say that because if we go back to the very original slide, the problem with Adani and all those other things is that they are worth that, depends on how you count, $75 trillion or $300 trillion. And so we have allowed the stock market to value the fossil fuels that we haven't pulled out of the mine yet, including Adani. And I bring up the William Wilberforce because I always thought that maybe the way, we may have to be creative. We may have to buy our way out of this.
We've got another question down here at the front.
Are you gonna write another book?
I am writing another book right now, and it's a really good question. And the book I'm writing right now is about all of the materials that humanity uses in all of our life. So the next book, I've got to get a lot of data. I'm going to look at just how many tons of steel humans use, just how many tons of cement. And I've already got some crazy statistics. So we are producing more than 1 ton of concrete per person per year for humanity right now. Every Australian uses about 20 kilograms of textiles per year. And I want to put all of those things in perspective and think about all of the materials in our economy, because solving climate change won't be great if we've dug too many holes and we've cut down too many trees. And so I want to figure out, is there a possible way for humans to actually live very lightly on the world? And a lot of this is about answering. So your question is really intelligent because it gets to something. A lot of people are now worried that, oh, but I don't like your electrification because what about the lithium, or what about recycling the solar cells, or et cetera, et cetera. And I can already tell you from the limited bit of work I've done so far in the book, there's potentially a really good outcome here. Electrification solves a huge number of problems. Half of the world's oceanic shipping is moving fossil fuels. Half of freight rail is moving fossil fuels. And so when we stop using fossil fuels, all of that material flow goes away. After water, the single substance that humans move the most of, carbon dioxide. After carbon dioxide, it's those 10 billion tons a year of fossil fuels. After the 10 billion tons a year of fossil fuels, it's the 8 billion tons of concrete. But in the future, when we're all electric, you'd only need, the average Australian individual today is 5,000 or 6,000 kilograms of fossil fuels per year, 15,000 kilograms of CO2 per year. But I could run your same life on 100 kilograms of solar cells, 100 kilograms of wind turbines, and 100 kilograms of batteries. Just turns out that those numbers are true. Batteries last, that's because it's sort of replacing the batteries every 10 years, the solar every 20, and the wind every 30. The good news, however, is those things are made out of metals. Metals are extremely recyclable. Steel is recycled about 80%, aluminium at 75%. My tasteless joke, copper is so recyclable that junkies do it for us. It's a better, worse joke in America because it's more true there, unfortunately. But that is to say, we should be able to, the car company BYD, not all of their batteries, they make a huge number of batteries, not all of them pass spec, and they can recycle 98% of the batteries that don't pass spec within their factory. So if we achieved 90%, or, let's shoot for 98% recycling of these things, the solar, the wind, and the batteries, because they're all made out of metals and glasses, we can, you can sort of squint and see a humanity that is zero emission and much, much lighter in the world than we are today. And so that's the book I'm working on next. So thanks for the question.
Nice question. Okay, we have a question from online now. It says, I'd love to hear Saul's view as to whether Fred, the case study, would work in Tasmania given our latitude and solar output and the fact that we have much greater energy consumption in winter.
It won't be as good in the sense that you'll get about half of the solar output that Fred does per solar cell. It's still worth doing the solar. You do have a winter peak, but so it's worse in that respect, but it's better because you have a lot more cheap hydro than Fred has access to.
And I don't remember the exact number, but I think we have better solar returns in Tasmania than you would in like England or.
Yeah, you get better than all of Europe. The other thing is your gas is more expensive and your petrol and diesel is more expensive. So you save more money against those. So actually I'd have to look in detail at the numbers. You may do better because of really the other fuels are the things that sting you here.
All right, another question from online, and then we might see if there's another one here in the audience. So are batteries funded by private operators at half the price of Marinus a better option than the taxpayer-funded Marinus link?
That's an excellent question. I would now like to do theatrical mathematical modeling with you all. The reality is that we don't even really know how to model the answer to that question. And so a bit of the tragedy is we're building these big transmission projects before we know what the cheapest answer is. And one of the big questions is we still don't, of the people who are getting battery on the side of their house, only 85% are voluntarily trading it on the market. Oh no, only 15%, 85% are rejecting the VPP. So we may not use the batteries as well to avoid the transmission as we could. You need to ask yourself, I personally think I think Marinus works in a lowest cost energy system for Australia. I also believe that we should connect West Australia to Eastern Australia. It turns out the geographic diversity of renewables is how you solve the winter problems and the cold, dark day problems. if Western, the Fremantle Doctor, which is the wind in Western Australia, it comes in at 2 in the afternoon, which is the East Coast's peak electricity evening time. So that would help us through. Right now, you use your hydro during the day and coal overnight. In the future, Tasmanian hydro could be the battery storage that is powering the rest of Australia overnight. That's a big, complicated model to build. It means it's not simple to answer the question. In general, we can use batteries to avoid a huge amount of transmission, but we can't use it to avoid all.
Great. We've got a question here in the audience.
Thanks for a great talk. You talked about how electrifying can reduce the energy required, but not about things like insulation or other sort of boring efficiency measures. Do you see a role for those?
I love boring efficiency measures. If you did every single efficiency measure you could to take a 3-star house to a 9-star house, you'll take in the future when it's an all electric house, you'll take the 32 kilowatt hours a day down to 30 kilowatt hours a day. As opposed to doing the electrification takes us from 100 down to 32. So by the numbers energetically, electrification achieves a hell of a lot more than efficiency. I still think we should do efficiency. The easiest one is just block the cracks under the doors and seal the windows. That's the cheapest one that gets you the most bang for your buck. The next ones are more expensive. So the double glazed windows, triple glazed windows, the insulation, that costs you a lot more. In Tasmania, very sensible to do those things. In the rest of Australia, less sensible economically. And it really speaks to the fact that the best time to do any of the efficiency measures is when you build a house. Very cheap to do it when you're building a house, very expensive to do it as a bespoke retrofit. So it's a really good argument to make sure we never build a bad drafty house in Australia again. Unfortunately, we are building them all the time. So we need higher building standards. But on the raw economics, the efficiency measures don't always stack up. They can create a much more comfortable house, and you should do the basics. So it's a read the book for the nuance.
There's a lot of skill and passion and experience in this room tonight, and and all the other audiences that you have. And I'm sure that many people here are already on the path of making the changes over the next 10 years. But how can this passion and skills be harnessed to really move that political agenda?
I think that's the most important question of all. We had the experience when we started agitating in my community 2515. We sort of almost won before we began. So we went and polled, there's 4,000 homes in our community, and we had a group of volunteers go and door knock every single one and say, hey, we're thinking of trying to accelerate electrification and solve climate in our community. Are you interested in helping? About 40% of the households said they are interested in helping. And that was sufficient to get the attention of the politicians that I was engaged with in Canberra. Just the anecdote that it's not just the fringe greenies that want to do this stuff anymore. It's broadly middle Australia. And it really was my experience that if we're going to create, and it was kind of on that and other work we did that helped give Labor permission and the courage to do things like HOOF and to do things like the home battery program. Like, they were generous enough to give us a little bit of credit. It's a lot of civil society groups advocating for these things. But that is to say, I think if we want the government to be more ambitious, the government's not going to do it until we prove to them that we want it and that it's electorally popular. And I think that's the question here, is how do we translate this audience? And the encouraging thing is I've done about 20 of these events around the country in the last few months. We've had between 100 and 500 people at every one of those events. Personally, still find it extraordinary that anyone would want to talk to an engineer talking about electric. That's pretty wild, but we're talking now with thousands and thousands of Australians that represent communities of millions of Australians that want to do, I mean, I suspect that's why everyone's here. They want to get in the fight for climate change. I think we are now a political force. I think writing letters to your members is good, but if we're all signing a form letter, I think politicians ignore that. I actually think we need to start contemplating collectively going to Canberra at significant points, the show of force, like thousands of us with a concise set of demands, a little bit. I tried to structure the talk tonight around the concise set of demands we might make of Australian government. We want financing mechanisms that help all Australians join this thing that will lower our cost of living and meet our climate goals. We want market reform that makes this fair for Australian households. We want you to stop protecting, Malaysian super fund companies that own our electricity grid, and we want you to start protecting our interests through market reform. And we want you to stop approving new gas projects. So I think we now need to translate this to old school democratic political action by showing the numbers and showing the force. And I think we're, for the first time, the climate movement has always been, what do you want? We want faster climate action right now. But the next step was not clear. It was always shut the gate and lock the door, but we got to keep the energy system running. So that wasn't quite practical. I think we now have this motivated set of people. We know we can do it. We know what we want, and it will build a better country. We just got to be loud collectively and individually to make that happen as fast as possible. I'll be sending out an email in about a week and asking you all to show up in Canberra sometime in May. Bring a pitchfork.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our discussion this evening.
Get him off.
No, thanks everyone who raised a question. Sadly, we didn't get to address them all, but I would now like to invite Margaret Steadman, Richard Jones Memorial Lecture Committee representative, to deliver the vote of thanks.
It's so wonderful to see a full hall. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you very much, Saul, for your talk tonight. I felt like the furniture in my brain was moving around as you spoke. And my favorite slide was the one of the coordination of the grid. That was really inspiring. I would like that as a sort of embroidery on a tapestry or something. The Richard Jones Memorial Lectures there have been 30 of them. And over the course of the years, they've reflected the increasing urgency of climate action, the dance between critical government policy and personal and community responsibility and action. And Saul's work and his talk tonight has been an inspiring example of it. Thank you for scaring us, and thank you for giving us a view of where we can go and what we can do. So please give him your thanks one more time. So thank you all for being part of tonight's conversation, and I'd like to reiterate Saul's call for us to be active in how we respond to his lecture. Keep doing your bit as an individual and in your community actions, and particularly, I think, in your participation in political process. And go home safely, and thank you for weathering the wind and coming tonight. Good night.